the 17th of January, 1944, 52,000 feet above the frozen spine of Germany. The air at this altitude is not air at all. It is a colorless vacuum where breath crystallizes before it leaves the lungs, where metal shrinks and rivets weep ice, where the only sound is the mechanical wheeze of oxygen masks and the distant thunder of Pratt & Whitney engines turning over in the thin, hostile atmosphere. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sits in the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, his leather gloves stiff with cold, his eyes scanning the pale winter sky through a windscreen hazed with frost. Below him, the patchwork farmlands of Bavaria stretch to the horizon, white and silent and impossibly far away. Above him, nothing. The sky belongs to no one yet. But in 7 minutes, that will change. He does not know it, but this morning marks a boundary, a line drawn across history that will never be erased. On the other side of that line, the Luftwaffe will cease to be what it was. On the other side, the sky will no longer be German. The radio crackles. A voice, tense and clipped, reports the approach of American bombers B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, dozens of them, perhaps 100, flying in their maddening tight formations that make them nearly impossible to destroy without dying in the attempt. Stigler adjusts his harness, checks his ammunition counter. He has done this 1,000 times. He has survived when most of his squadron has not. He knows the bombers will come with escorts P-47 Thunderbolts, maybe, brutish and heavily armoured, capable of taking punishment but slow to turn. He can outmaneuver them. He always has. But then he sees them. Not thunderbolts, something else, something new. They come in from the west, silver and slender, their wings knife-thin, their fuselages gleaming in the pale January sun like polished chrome. They move with a kind of predatory elegance he has never seen before, fast, impossibly fast, slicing through the air with an economy of motion that makes his Messerschmitt feel suddenly heavy, suddenly obsolete. P-51 Mustangs. He has heard rumors, whispers in the pilot's mess, stories dismissed as exaggeration, as propaganda. But here they are, real and lethal and everywhere. One of them rolls inverted above him. A casual maneuver executed with such precision it seems almost arrogant, and Stigler feels something he has not felt in 3 years of combat. Not fear, exactly, but a cold recognition that the calculus of air warfare has shifted beneath him, that the mathematics of speed and fuel and altitude have been rewritten by an enemy he once dismissed as mechanically inferior, tactically naive, industrially incapable of challenging the supremacy of German engineering. He was wrong. They were all wrong. To understand what happened in the skies over Germany in 1944, one must first understand what the Luftwaffe believed about itself, about its enemies, and about the nature of air power. In 1939, when the Wehrmacht rolled across Poland in a campaign that lasted 35 days, the Luftwaffe was the most formidable air force on the planet. Its pilots were veterans of the Spanish Civil War, blooded and skilled, flying aircraft designed with a singular focus on tactical superiority. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, introduced in 1937, was faster and more maneuverable than anything the British or French could field. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber became a symbol of terror, its sirens wailing as it plunged toward targets with mechanical precision. The doctrine was clear. Air power existed to support ground forces, to shatter enemy defenses, to create the conditions for blitzkrieg. And it worked. France fell in 6 weeks. The Low Countries collapsed in days. By the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority over half of Europe. German pilots flew with a confidence born not of arrogance, but of proven dominance. They had outflown, outfought, and outlasted everyone they encountered. Even during the Battle of Britain, a campaign that strained German resources and exposed vulnerabilities in their strategic bombing doctrine, the Luftwaffe maintained a psychological edge. They believed, with some justification, that no other nation could match their combination of training, technology, and tactical doctrine. Then came the Americans. At first, they were easy to dismiss. The United States Army Air Forces arrived in England in 1942 with crews so inexperienced they could barely maintain formation. Their bombers, massive, lumbering B-17 flying fortresses, were heavily armed but slow, vulnerable to flak and fighters alike. Their early raids were tentative, poorly coordinated, conducted in small numbers with inadequate fighter escort. The Luftwaffe tore them apart. On the 17th of August 1943, during a raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg, the Americans lost 60 bombers and over 600 men in a single day. German pilots returned to base elated, convinced that the Americans had neither the stomach nor the skill for sustained daylight bombing. But the Americans did not stop. They rebuilt. They adapted. And they did something the Luftwaffe never anticipated. They solved the escort problem. The problem was simple in theory, maddeningly complex in practice. To destroy German industrial capacity, American bombers needed to strike deep into the Reich targets in Berlin, Munich, Schweinfurt, places hundreds of miles from the relative safety of English airfields. But no Allied fighter in 1942 had the range to accompany them. The Supermarine Spitfire, beloved and lethal in defensive operations, could barely cross the English Channel before needing to turn back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, introduced in 1943, could reach the German border with drop tanks, but no farther. Beyond that perimeter, the bombers flew alone, and the Luftwaffe waited. The solution required innovation on a scale that defied the economic and engineering pessimism of German planners. In early 1943, North American Aviation took a British engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that drove the Spitfire, and mated it to an American airframe designed with a single purpose, range. The result was the P-51 Mustang, an aircraft that could fly over 1,500 miles on internal fuel and more than 2,000 miles with external drop tanks. It could escort bombers to Berlin and back. It could dogfight at 400 miles per hour. It could climb to 40,000 feet. And the Americans built them by the thousands. By January 1944, the first Mustang groups were operational over Europe. By February, they were escorting deep penetration raids into the heart of Germany. By March, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a decorated fighter ace with 33 confirmed kills, described the change in his diary with a kind of stunned disbelief. "We are no longer the hunters," he wrote. "We have become the hunted." The Americans, he noted, did not merely defend their bombers, they hunted German fighters with a methodical aggression that left little room for the old tactics of slashing attacks and high-speed disengagement. The Mustangs stayed with the bombers all the way to the target, yes, but they also ranged ahead, prowling for German fighters at their assembly points, strafing airfields, intercepting aircraft before they could form up for coordinated attacks. The sky, which had once been a German domain, became a contested space, then an American one. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 aircraft on all fronts. In February, another 1,100. In March, 2,115. By the end of what the Germans would call Big Week, a series of coordinated raids in late February, targeting German aircraft production, the Luftwaffe had lost not just planes but pilots, irreplaceable men with years of combat experience. Men who could not be replaced by the poorly trained teenagers, now being rushed through abbreviated flight schools and thrown into combat with 50 hours of flying time. The Americans lost planes too, hundreds of them. But they replaced them within weeks, they replaced the crews within days, and they kept coming. What did it feel like for a German pilot to watch this transformation, to see the sky that had belonged to him and his comrades slowly, inexorably, fill with enemy aircraft? Lieutenant Gustav Rödel, who survived the war with 98 victories, described it in an interview decades later as a kind of psychological erosion. "At first," he said, "we thought the Americans were incompetent, their formations were ragged, their gunnery was poor. We could approach from below, pick off stragglers, to escape before the escorts arrived. But every week they improved. Their formations tightened, their gunners learned to lead their targets. And then the Mustangs came, and everything changed. The Mustang was not merely a technical achievement. It was a symbol of something the Germans had not accounted for: the sheer industrial and logistical capacity of the United States. Rodel remembered seeing formations of 50, 60, 70 bombers, each one bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, each one protected by a swarm of fighters. He remembered the exhaust trails crisscrossing the sky like a spider's web, so dense that it seemed the air itself was full of Americans. He remembered thinking, for the first time, that the war was lost not because of tactics or strategy, but because the Americans simply had more of everything: more planes, more fuel, more ammunition, more men, and more willingness to use them. German pilots had been trained to husband their resources, to make every sortie count, to avoid unnecessary risks. The Americans seemed to operate under a different calculus entirely. They accepted losses that would have paralyzed a Luftwaffe group. They flew in weather that grounded German aircraft. They attacked relentlessly, day after day, grinding down German defenses, not through superior skill, though that came, in time, but through sheer, relentless pressure. Major Günther Roll, the third highest scoring ace in history, described a mission in March 1944 when his Staffel intercepted a formation of B-17 seconds near Stuttgart. There must have been 50 fighters escorting them, he recalled. We shot down 2 bombers, lost 4 of our own pilots, and achieved nothing. The bombers continued to their target. They dropped their bombs, they flew home, and the next day they came back. This was the new reality. The Luftwaffe could win individual engagements, shoot down bombers, claim victories, but it could not stop the raids. It could not protect German cities. It could not prevent American fighters from roaming freely over the Reich, strafing trains, attacking airfields, shooting down transports. The sky, which had once been a source of German pride, became a source of despair. There is a photograph, taken in April 1944, that captures something essential about this transformation. It shows a P-51 Mustang on a forward airfield in England, its nose painted with black and white invasion stripes, its drop tanks empty and discarded on the tarmac. The pilot, a young lieutenant from Indiana named Robert Johnson, stands beside it, grinning, his hands on his hips. Behind him, ground crew members are already refueling the aircraft, rearming the guns, preparing it for another mission. The entire process takes less than 30 minutes. Contrast this with the German experience. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was critically short of fuel. Pilots were rationed to a few training flights before being thrown into combat. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of spare parts. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep a dwindling number of fighters operational. The industrial base that had once produced over 1,000 aircraft per month was crippled by Allied bombing, its factories dispersed into forests and tunnels, its workforce depleted by conscription and casualties. The Americans, meanwhile, were producing over 9,000 aircraft per month. They had fuel to burn, literally. Training flights in the United States routinely exceeded 100 hours. Pilots arrived in England with more flying time than many Luftwaffe veterans. They flew missions in aircraft that were maintained to exacting standards, fueled with high-octane gasoline, armed with ammunition that never seemed to run out. This disparity extended beyond mere numbers. It was a disparity of systems, of logistics, of national capacity. The Mustang's Merlin engine, for instance, required high-grade fuel that the Germans could no longer produce in sufficient quantities. The American logistics network could deliver that fuel to airfields in England, France, and Italy with mechanical efficiency. The German equivalent was collapsing under the weight of partisan attacks, Allied bombing, and simple entropy. Feldwebel Willy Reschke, a mechanic with Jagdgeschwader 11, described the frustration in a letter smuggled out through a Swiss contact. "We work miracles with nothing," he wrote. "We patch holes with aluminum scavenged from wrecks. We siphon fuel from damaged aircraft. We sleep 4 hours a night and wake to the sound of American engines overhead. And still, the planes come. They never stop coming." By summer 1944, The nature of air combat over Europe had fundamentally changed. The Luftwaffe, once the aggressor, now fought a desperate defensive war. Pilots were ordered to focus exclusively on bombers, to ignore the escorts, and accept the losses necessary to break up American formations. It was a strategy born of desperation, and it failed. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. The Luftwaffe managed to fly fewer than 300 sorties on D-Day. The Allies flew over 14,000. German pilots who ventured over the beaches were swarmed by Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires. Most did not return. Oberst Josef Pips Priller, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders, made a single strafing run over Sword Beach in the morning and spent the rest of the day in hiding, his aircraft too damaged to fly, the sky too dangerous to re-enter. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers on the ground, who had grown accustomed to Luftwaffe support during the campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, now looked up to see only enemy aircraft. The absence of German planes became a source of bitter jokes, dark humor masking deep demoralization. "Don't worry," soldiers told each other. "The Luftwaffe is still fighting, just not here." For the pilots themselves, the experience was even more harrowing. They were flying obsolete aircraft, outnumbered and outmatched, against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources. They watched friends die, not in the dramatic dogfights of popular imagination, but in grinding, attritional combats where survival was a matter of luck as much as skill. They flew missions knowing they would likely not return, and many did not. Major Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 victories, described the period from June to September 1944 as a descent into hell. "The Mustangs," he said, "were everywhere like mosquitoes, like flies. They attacked German fighters during takeoff and landing, when they were most vulnerable. They loitered over German airfields, waiting for aircraft to return low on fuel and ammunition. They hunted in pairs and quartets, coordinating attacks with a discipline that German pilots, increasingly thrown together in ad hoc formations, could not match. The symbolic object that haunted German pilots during this period was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but a sound, the high, keening whistle of the Merlin engine at full throttle. It was a sound that announced the presence of Mustangs, a sound that preceded death. Pilots learned to recognize it instantly, to react to it with Pavlovian dread. Even decades after the war, survivors reported hearing that sound in their dreams, a ghost from a sky they once dominated. The transformation was not merely technical or tactical, it was ideological. The Germans had entered the war convinced of their racial and cultural superiority, certain that their engineering, their discipline, their warrior ethos would carry them to victory. The Americans, they believed, were soft, undisciplined, more interested in comfort than conflict. How could a nation of individualists and democrats, who valued personal freedom over collective sacrifice, hope to match the focused will of the Reich? But the sky over Germany in 1944 told a different story. It told a story of a nation that could mobilize its industrial base with ruthless efficiency, that could train pilots by the thousands, that could absorb losses that would have broken a smaller power and continue fighting. It told a story of democracy not as weakness but as strength, a system capable of harnessing the talents and energies of millions, of innovating and adapting faster than any totalitarian state. The Mustang itself became a symbol of this ideological clash. It was not a product of state diktat or military command, but of collaboration, British engines, American airframes, innovations drawn from pilots' feedback and engineers' ingenuity. It was a weapon born of open debate and pragmatic problem-solving, not dogma, and it worked. German pilots, for their part, could not reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught to believe. How could the Americans, whom propaganda had depicted as decadent and cowardly, produce pilots who flew with such aggression? How could a nation of shopkeepers and farmers outbuild the industrial might of the Reich? The cognitive dissonance was profound, and it manifested in different ways. Some pilots grew cynical, their faith in the regime eroding with each mission. Others doubled down, clinging to the belief that secret weapons, jets, rockets, miracle technologies would turn the tide. A few simply stopped thinking about it, focusing only on survival. Lieutenant Horst Petzschler, who flew me 262 jets late in the war, described this psychological shift in stark terms. "We stopped believing in victory," he said. "We flew because we were ordered to fly. We fought because stopping meant dying even faster. But we knew. We all knew." By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Pilot losses exceeded replacement rates by a factor of 3. Fuel shortages grounded entire Geschwaders. The introduction of jet aircraft technologically superior, but plagued by engine failures and fuel shortages, came too late and in too small numbers to alter the trajectory of the air war. The Mustangs continued to dominate, ranging deep into Germany, escorting bombers to targets that would once have been unreachable, strafing anything that moved on the ground. On the 2nd of November 1944, a formation of P-51 seconds from the 357th Fighter Group encountered a staffel of Bf-109 seconds near Magdeburg. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. 7 German fighters were shot down. The Mustangs lost none. It was not an exceptional engagement by that point. Such outcomes were routine. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies. It could only endure. The final months of the war saw German pilots flying missions that were suicidal in everything but name. They attacked bomber formations with single-engine fighters carrying unguided rockets, closing to point-blank range in the hope of inflicting casualties before being shot down. They rammed bombers in acts of desperation masked as heroism. They flew aircraft cobbled together from wrecks, fueled with synthetic gasoline that corroded engines, armed with ammunition that jammed and misfired. The Americans, by contrast, flew in formations so large they blotted out the sun. They flew with confidence bordering on impunity. They flew knowing that the sky belonged to them, that the enemy was broken, that the war was won. The war ended in May 1945. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the conflict as the world's most formidable air force, ceased to exist. Its aircraft were scattered across a defeated nation, wrecked and rusting in fields and forests. Its pilots were dead, captured, or dispersed. Its legacy was one of initial brilliance, followed by inexorable decline. And yet, in the years after the war, something curious happened. German pilots who had fought against the Americans often spoke of them with a kind of grudging respect. They acknowledged the skill, the aggression, the relentless pressure. They marveled at the logistics, the industrial capacity, the sheer abundance that allowed the Americans to replace losses overnight. They recognized, in a way that their leaders never fully did, that they had been defeated not by a single weapon or tactic, but by a system, a democratic, capitalist, innovative system that could outproduce, outthink, and outlast them. Günther Rahl, the ace who had described the futility of defending against American bombers, later became a close friend of American pilots he had fought against. He flew in airshows with them, drank with them, swapped stories. "We were enemies," he said once, "but we were never different. We were all pilots. We all loved flying. The difference was, they had a country that could win a war, and we did not." The Mustang, that silver symbol of American air power, went on to serve in conflicts around the world. But its greatest victory was not tactical or strategic, it was ideological. It proved that a democracy could wage total war, that abundance and innovation were weapons as potent as bombs and bullets, that the sky belonged not to the most fanatical or the most disciplined, but to those who could build, adapt, and endure. On a cold morning in January, high above the frozen heart of Germany, a young German pilot looks up and sees the contrails of American fighters stretching to the horizon. He knows, with a certainty that settles in his chest like a stone, that he will not survive the war. He knows that the sky he once commanded is no longer his. He knows that everything he was taught about superiority, about destiny, about the inevitability of victory was a lie. He does not yet know that, 70 years later, historians will study the battles he fought and conclude that the outcome was never in doubt. that the moment the first Mustang crossed into German airspace, the war was already over. He does not know that the sound of those Merlin engines, which haunts his nightmares, will come to symbolize not just defeat, but transformation, the moment when the old certainties collapsed and the world learned that freedom, for all its messiness and contradictions, was the stronger force. All he knows is that the sky is full of silver planes, and they are not his. And in that realization, in that cold and final understanding, the war is lost.